Hello, faithful students. Welcome. I realize that some of the articles that you read probably need a little bit of unpacking by me, so I'm going to be making one video about when brothers share a wife and one video about the TIV, the article by Bohannon. So sit back and relax, have a cup of joe. Damn, that's good coffee. Okay, so let's talk about where this article takes place. It takes place in Limi, Nepal, which, if you don't know where it is, I didn't. It's right in the northwest corner of Nepal. You see up here. See, here's this sort of long, skinny country here is Nepal. And it borders Tibet, which is technically, at this point, part of China. And it's also close to India. So the individuals that are featured in the article are ethnically Tibetan, but they live in Nepal. And so that's just a closer view of Limi that I found on Google Maps. And if you want to see the satellite view, ooh, look at that. So as you can tell, it's quite mountainous. It's part of the Himalayas. So we're talking pretty high altitude here. So here's some pictures of what it looks like in this area. Again, you can see the mountains, high altitude. There are some fields, some arable, which means able to be farmed fields. But there's also a lot of dry area, and as you can imagine, it can get quite cold. So the lowest altitude in this area, according to the article, is 12,900 feet. Agriculture is only feasible up to about 13,300 feet. Why is that? That's because the frost and the snow and the freezing weather occurs too soon for there to be any real growing season above that. So it's just not feasible to grow your own food above that altitude. So in addition to that, rainfall is pretty sparse in some areas. Precipitation is fairly sparse in some areas. I assume that means particularly during the growing season because there's obviously snow in different places, but that's because they're in a rain shadow. Some of these areas are in a rain shadow, which essentially is what we're in here in Las Vegas. So because of like the Sierra Nevadas and so on, most of the precipitation falls on the other side or in the mountains. And by the time it would get here, it's gone, right? So in other words, land that you can use for farming is quite scarce and quite precious. In areas where land is not suitable for farming, such as altitudes higher than 13,300 feet, the Tibetans in this area rely on pastoralism or animal husbandry. So taking herds of livestock up to those areas where they can graze on the plants and grasses that are hardy enough to grow there. So these pictures are all yaks because I think they're pretty cool. But in addition to yaks, the article says there are also sometimes herds of cattle, sheep, and goats that are grazed. And so a lot of these families that have land for agriculture will also, because it's probably not a lot of land, they will also have herds of animals that they will graze at higher altitudes to supplement what they can get from agriculture with milk. And obviously you can, for sheep and goats and presumably these yaks, they look pretty fuzzy. You can, use some of that for clothing and weaving, and you can sell things and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the kinship and marriage system. So the article sort of implies, without saying directly, that society in this area is patrilineal and patrilocal. I mean, it all but says that. Any kind of property that's owned is passed on to the males in the family. So that includes land, that includes animals, that includes clothing, anything that's in the homestead. And patrilocal means that when individuals get married, the woman would typically move in with the man. So although this article features one particular type, there are several types of marriage practiced in this area. There's fraternal polyandry, which is what the article is really about. There is monogamy, and there is polygyny. So just to refresh your memory, polygamy, which is what the word that's most commonly used, simply means multiple spouses. It doesn't specify the sex of the spouse, just multiple spouses. So that's sort of an umbrella term. Polygyny means multiple wives, and polyandry means multiple husbands, okay? So in fraternal polyandry, there are multiple husbands, and those husbands are brothers. So one woman will marry however many brothers there are in this family. I don't know if there's a limit. The article doesn't go into that. If they have like a bunch of kids and there's like 6 brothers, it doesn't really go into that. It does go into some of the logistics of it, which I'm not really going to get into here because I don't want to make this a super long video. But if there's a brother that's substantially younger, that brother will technically be part of the marriage, but they won't really move into that house and enter into the marriage until they're like in their late teen years. Yes. So when a woman marries brothers, she will move into the brothers in their family, move in with the brothers into their family home. So this brings up some key questions about fraternal polyandry, especially for a quote Westerner, someone who may be more familiar with monogamous type marriage. Do these individuals have a choice, or are they forced into fraternal polyandry? Well, they do have a choice. In fact, they could choose monogamy, or in certain cases polygyny, but the article says polygyny is usually only practiced when the wife in the marriage is barren and can't have children. So I suppose at that point another wife might be taken. So if they do have a choice, if both the brothers and the woman have a choice, why do so many in this region choose fraternal polyandry? The article talks about a couple of explanations that have been offered by outsiders in the past. Some think, oh, well, it's because there's an uneven number of females and males. So there's a practice of female infanticide where female infants are killed because it's a patrilineal society, and men only males can pass on the family inheritance. So there's an imbalance in the sex ratio. Some say, well, because they're in such an ecologically marginal area where agriculture is extremely difficult and land is scarce, that if they didn't practice, they would all starve. And these are not correct. So just to address that first one about female infanticide, the article talks about how infanticide has never been an institutionalized practice in this region. There may be some families who have done it. It's actually something, there's types of infanticide that have occurred at different times all around the world. Hard as that may seem to fathom for a variety of reasons, but no, there is not a widespread practice of female infanticide, and it is not, there's no imbalance in the sex ratio. In fact, the article talks about how there, in some region, it might have been this specific region, there were more essentially women of reproductive age than men at the same age. So the other one, is it necessary for all people in this region to follow this practice or face starvation? No, and we're gonna kind of get to that in this slide here. So in traditional Tibetan society, Let's say up until, I don't know, the early to mid 20th century, I'm assuming, there was the landless poor. So, as the name would imply, these were people who did not own any land, and they would have few, if any, animals. And so they would survive by agricultural labor, as in selling their labor to someone who did have land, by tenant farming, which is similar. I suppose that's where they would be lent some land to work on, but they would have to give a substantial amount of what they produced to the owner of the land. They could make crafts, various craft occupations, carpentry, and so on. They could work as servants. And typically, the landless poor would marry monogamously, even though the article talks about how they could practice fraternal polyandry, and it might make some economic sense in terms of slightly raising their standard of living if they had multiple brothers who were able to perform multiple jobs and provide for the family. But the negatives outweighed the benefits in that situation. Because, the article doesn't try to paint some rosy picture that this is a utopia and it's the easiest possible form of marriage in the world. I think if you keep your eyes and ears open, just as a casual observer in the world at large, you'll find that marriage is not easy in general, no matter what type of marriage you practice, because you're two independent or more, maybe not just two, independent human beings. And you wouldn't want to marry yourself, but on the other hand, when you're married to someone who's not yourself, you disagree a lot. Yeah. So anyway, and obviously, if you watch the video, not the lecture video, but the video that I posted, you'll see they have to work out who gets to have sex when, and there can be some jealousy, although it's not as much as you would think, it seems. And obviously it's very difficult for the wife, and it's not always again like a utopia, but it's a situation that is chosen and works for certain reasons. Okay, so I'm moving on. The other social stratum that I'm going to talk about, there was obviously like an aristocracy, like a higher level government, but the other level of sort of regular people I'm going to talk about is peasant landowning families. So obviously they owned land, probably not a whole lot, but enough to farm on, and animals, and all of that is passed on to the male heirs. And they would typically marry polyandrously. They would practice fraternal polyandry. So why would they do that? Well, it turns out, ecology does have a lot to do with it. But I wanted to make the distinction that the article made that it's not that people would all starve if not for fraternal polyandry, because it is possible to make a living if you choose not to practice fraternal polyandry. But it is the thing that makes the most sense if you come from a landowning family. It makes the most sense economically and ecologically. So a brother, okay, so wait, before I get into that, sorry, I put this is an image from the article. And the way it works is, let's say you have a certain plot of land. Now, that land is not getting any bigger. That's the land that your family has. So in the first generation, let's say there are 3 brothers. Now, on the one hand, with polyandry, those 3 brothers take one wife. And on the other hand, with monogamy, we'll just compare these two systems. Those brothers each take their own wife. And let's say that each married group has 3 sons. Okay, so on the side of polyandry, in the next generation, generation 2, those three sons will take one wife, and they will inherit the plot of land from their parents. Okay. With a monogamous situation, each of the three male children of each of the three couples would be entitled to their own land. So now you would go and you would divide up that land into 9 parcels, because now you have, 9 sons, okay? Now, if each of those sons takes a wife in the third generation, looking at the monogamous side here, you'd have 9 times 3, which is 27, right? And you'd have to split that land up again. Now, with fraternal polyandry, it doesn't matter because those brothers are going to take one wife, okay? So, it keeps the land together. Now, in medieval Europe, there was a similar system of patrilineal inheritance where males would inherit the family farm if the family did own land. But they had a system called primogeniture, which means that only the oldest son would inherit the land. The other sons were SOL, so to speak, and they would have to either join the military or join the clergy and become priests or ministers, or go off and find their fortunes somewhere else. And in a place where it's not so economically marginal, and where there's a large state apparatus, maybe that's possible. But in this region, that would be very difficult to do. In this region that we're talking about, a practice like that wouldn't really be sustainable. So a brother, in theory, could decide to go it alone. And that brother, let's say it's a younger brother, it's not the oldest brother, because the oldest brother does have more authority in Tibetan society. But let's say a younger brother decides to go it alone. Well, he probably would not get an equal share of the land, because even though in theory they're all entitled to a share of the family's wealth, this practice is frowned upon, and there's all different ways, legal and otherwise, that the family could fight this and tie it up. And it seems, according to the article, in most cases, a son who decides to go it alone, a brother who decides to go it alone, only gets a small portion of the family property. And, so they'd probably get a small piece of land, not many animals at all, probably. And they wouldn't really get much of what is in the household, clothes that are passed down through generations and other types of wealth. So they'd be starting out with not very much. And if they decided to try to find new land that hadn't been, that wasn't owned, that you could theoretically grow crops on, it's very difficult to get that land ready for cultivation because they live in an area that's extremely rocky. And so they have to dig down, I forgot how far it said, but a significant depth just to make sure that they get all the gravel and rocks and boulders and stones out of their land. And it would take a serious and significant investment of time just to bring a small parcel of land under control for agriculture if you're starting from scratch. Add to that the fact that if you had any animals, how do you go up and take them to higher altitudes and graze them, which, in which case you're gone for a period of time, not just like an hour or two. You're gone for, I don't know, days, weeks, maybe months. How can you do that and deal with, trying to start a field? It's very difficult. So that's that second bullet point. A woman going alone would face also problems, some similar. She would have a choice of either living at her family home which probably gets crowded and, maybe isn't the kind of place that someone wants to be when their brothers have taken a wife and have kids, and and then you're kind of there as a additional wheel, and probably also another mouth to feed, and it just might make it more difficult. She could try to find one of those single brothers that had left a polyandrous relationship, but he, as we saw from the above, he would be quite economically unstable. So she'd be choosing a life of hard labor, barely scraping by. She could try to set up her own household, although she wouldn't be inheriting any land or any of the family wealth. She could work as a servant. She could become a Buddhist nun. She could go do wage labor. None of which are fantastic options, especially in that area. So it just makes the most sense. If you want the easiest, not easy, but the easiest life possible among those choices, and the so-called good life, fraternal polyandry is the choice that has traditionally made the most sense for landowning families in that region. Add to that, there's some other odds and ends I wanted to mention. In the old system, there was a system of corvée labor, which means that whatever kind of lords or aristocrats in the area there were, they required labor from each household. So you'd have to give, I don't know if it was like 1 day a week. It probably depended on the specific area, the specific lord, whatever. But you would have to give a person to do free labor for this aristocrat, let's say one full day a week. So if you're just a monogamous pair, that's going to be really difficult. With fraternal polyandry, it allows, if one brother has to go and do that, and they can rotate, they can take turns doing that, and you still have the other brothers, however many there are, to help take care of the fields and deal with the animals. There's also, there's kind of a renewal. I don't know exactly when this article was written. Sometime after 2011, the end of it was written. But when Tibet, here's a disclaimer, I don't know the history of Tibet or Nepal very well, but when this region, I guess, was, or at least Tibet, taken over by the Chinese, or at the very least the Communist Party, the land was taken and communes were created. So the old system disappeared. And everybody was working on communes that were communally owned, right? So when in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when that system ended because China started to adopt more free market type policies and open up business to the West, those communes then were divided evenly among families. So that meant, if you were a family of six, and each person wanted a share of the land, you'd have to divide that up in 6 parts. If you practice fraternal polyandry, you could keep it together. And so, again, it created a new situation where you had the same kind of factors happening. So anyway, that's something that's kept it going. One other thing to note is that it helps with population control, even though that is not a conscious reason that people say that they choose fraternal polyandry. As you can imagine, like a woman can only give birth to so many children at once. So, so if you have three brothers married to one woman, it limits the number of offspring that they can produce together. And whereas if you have monogamous couples, right, each one of those couples can produce a lot of children in theory. Now, women who do not get married, or let's say women who don't get married, because as you imagine, if there's multiple brothers for each woman, then there's going to be a lot of women that are not married. The article points out that that doesn't mean that they don't reproduce. And it's not something that's looked down upon. It's something that's accepted. I don't know if it's encouraged, but it's accepted. So obviously, women who aren't in fraternal polyandry situations can have additional children, but the rate of childbirth is significantly lower, the article said. So it actually does help to keep the population at a level that's supportable in this ecological zone, even though that's not what people say motivates them. So anyway, that's an overview of the article. Hope that helps. I will create and post another one of these for the Bohannon article soon. Okay, see you soon. Bye.